There's one particular aspect of realization, one particular adjustment that I find being the most challenging for people. This often comes later in the process. However, there are periods of it earlier as well, but it's usually not so obvious what's actually happening or what the challenge is until later on. And that is, simply put, we have to transition from orientation, or the feeling of knowing how to orient, the feeling of knowing how to relate to life, to relate to the world in abstraction. That's important, that we're doing this in abstraction without realizing it. We're doing it through the lens of thought. But we orient to what we consider to be the world, what we consider to be ourselves, what we consider to be our lives, what we perceive to be other people. We relate to all of that with a certain kind of orientation that makes us feel stable. Now, as the awakening process starts to unfold, that kind of orientation breaks down, starts to break down at least. And it can happen rapidly in a certain way where it can feel very disorienting. And typically what happens is that disorientation lasts a little while, and then we kind of reorient. We might reorient a little differently. We might reorient in the same way. But each time we reorient, there's a little more clarity about what's happening, a little more clarity about the nature of thought, a little more clarity about the nature of illusion. So it's a good thing that this happens, that we go through these periods of disorientation or stirring the pot, so to speak, and then things settle again and we kind of find ourselves reoriented in a slightly different way. Now, in later stage realization, the ability to reorient in that way at all starts to break down. So now, what we before had perceived as periods of disorientation now starts to become a new way of living. So there's a transition between what I might just call disorientation, which the dis could also be said to come with some dysphoria, or something that's uncomfortable, or something that just feels maybe not off, because instinctually you know this is the way, you know this is how it has to be, and it's clear. There's a clarity here. At the same time, there is something that feels like it wants to grasp, and there's nothing to grasp for. It wants to know where it stands, and there's no ground to stand on. And that feeling itself can be uncomfortable, rather uncomfortable for a while. It's like your foundation's not there. And that's not going to feel comfortable when you've been taking comfort from foundation, when you've been not taking comfort, but using the idea, the experience of foundation, of orientation, to provide yourself comfort. That's mind identification. So now, when you don't have that to derive the experience of comfort from, it can feel uncomfortable. It's like, well, where do you find comfort now? And in a way, you don't find comfort really in the same context that you did before. You learn that you don't need to, actually. Rather, you find something better, but it's different, and it's doesn't necessarily happen immediately. It can take some time. But what happens is we transition from disorientation to something like non-orientation. And then there's these wonderful phrases like abide in not abiding, or orient to no orientation, or hold the view of no view. And it's a really wonderful way to live, but it does take adjustment. It takes some time. It takes some realignment, let's say. It's kind of like, this is just a simple analogy, and I don't think it's fully accurate, but I think it is something like this. It's like when a plane takes off, say a small plane, and it has a landing gear, it needs the landing gear to take off, right? But as it takes off, the landing gear is like causing drag, and this doesn't happen, but it could potentially snag on things or something, right? The landing gear is extra once the plane has taken flight. So at some point, that landing gear has to retract, and it will, right? But we can feel like there's something extra to us trying to orient to something that's not there anymore, right? The ground isn't there anymore. We don't need a landing gear. So the sense of the self oriented to everything in life in the way it thinks it understands it, which is all based on illusion. It's all based on thought, but it's not there anymore, or that self can't find that which it used to orient to. So it feels like drag. It feels like you keep looking back to try to find something to make yourself feel better, instead of just realizing you don't have to make yourself feel better anymore. You're not in the business of trying to fix what you're oriented to, because there's nothing there. So there's the problem solving feeling can kind of go on, like I need to fix something. Then you just realize there's nothing to fix, and there never has been anything to fix. And there's a huge freedom in that, of course. And you know that freedom early on too. Often with an awakening, you feel a lot of that at first, and then the deep shadow stuff comes into consciousness, and then you go through all that. So we know this instinctually, that it's okay, and we know that this is a reorientation that will happen, and it will happen naturally, and it's okay that it's happening. And we don't always realize that there's a kind of finite amount of that really heavy repressed material. It can come at any time, of course, but it's not going to be super intense forever. It just doesn't really do that. Especially if you're resourceful about how you work through it and work with it and so forth. But we don't need to go into all the shadow material stuff now. I have plenty of material on that. The point I want to make is we can make the transition from disorientation, or the dysphoria that comes with not being able to orient to illusion anymore, to non-orientation, to where we don't try anymore. We don't worry about orienting. It's just not an issue. We don't constantly try to look back to find, what it is that we can count on to solidify a self to move forward. You don't need to do any of that. None of that was happening in the first place. So there's just what's appearing, really. There's just appearance now. Just appearance and the sort of exuberance of that luminous nature. It's beautiful. Also the fascinating unbinding that's always happening, always the letting go that's endless. It's so beautiful. And those two aren't two. To see that marriage, in a way, that interpenetration of luminosity and empty nature or essencelessness, is rather beautiful. And that's when the landing gear is up. You don't need to try to reorient to a self that wasn't there. You don't need to try to reorient to a whole system of beliefs and stabilizing illusions, because you see it wasn't there anyway. None of that was there. It was just a belief holding onto another belief, or struggling with struggle. And that can slow down a lot and come to a stop, actually. And you will find here, and almost everyone does, that it, although it is structured in thought, and even in deeper realization, even beyond no self-realization, it's still very valuable to be alert to beliefs, to latent beliefs, hidden beliefs that affect behavior, that affect perception. It's very helpful to continue to orient to those, to question and inquire as to what belief might be functioning here. What you do find, with all that said, is that the feeling of letting go that comes with this is really deep. It doesn't feel like a thought. It feels rather energetic. There's a sort of tether that sort of seems to want to pull your attention back into that stabilizing massive illusions for a little while. And that's okay. Some people just perceive that someday that tether just cuts. It's just gone. It's not there anymore. Others, it's a slow process, and either way is fine. So that's the deal with moving from disorientation to non-orientation, and trusting. There's a huge element, in my opinion, in my experience, of trust in this. Trusting the process itself, even though you don't understand it, even though you've never understood it, even though I've never understood it really. I know how to talk about it. Apparently, it just comes out of my mouth, but. There's a wisdom in this. There's a wisdom to this, to life, of course, and also this process of unbinding that goes completely beyond the intellect. It goes beyond the human dimension. It just does. And to trust that. Call it the Dharma, call it the Dharma vehicle if you want to. Call it. People might call it God, but I think at some point that at least your personal perception of what God is and what God means to you and all that will usually drop, because you'll see the selfish orientation in that. That you're actually projecting your own sense of self onto a deity or something. And when that goes, it's like, whoa, there's a vastness and an emptiness and a radiance that's available all the time. And it doesn't have a name, and it doesn't have a name. But there's a trust in this, at least in this relative process that has walked you to this precipice, walked you over the precipice, that has shown you everything you need to see to continue to dispel illusion. Like, to have a trust in that is very valuable. So I think that is an important component of this movement from disorientation to not reorientation, but living out of non-orientation. I think I'm just making words up now. Anyway, hopefully that's helpful.